So welcome everybody to another episode of Mondays with Maishi. This is Moshe Norman here out of Lakewood, New Jersey, and tonight we're going to be discussing the topic of 0 to 3, that's infancy, till I don't know what you call it, toddlerhood, with Professor, is it?
Yeah, that's good.
That's good. Gil Foley. So thank you very much for joining us tonight and agreeing to discuss this very, very important topic, which is essentially, I think, what we therapists call the early stages of the beginning of the attachment process. Would that be about right?
Yes, it's an important piece of it. Yeah.
Is there more than just attachment?
Well, there's more. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, let's hear a little bit about, early, obviously we all know that early development is vital. It's crucial to a person's future development, to their relationships, to their way of relating with themselves, with the world, and emotional regulation. Why don't you give us just a little bit of a broad overview of those first 3 years, what's really actually taking place during those years, and then, obviously the contribution of the primary caregiver and others who, and how that contributes.
Okay. Well, I think to start, it's an exciting time because, the organism is changing so dramatically and so rapidly. And I think, the important thing, or one important thing to keep in mind is that, we when we're born, our brain is still very much a work in progress. And so a lot of the maturation of the brain and the central nervous system really is occurring quite rapidly during those 3 years. So it's an incredibly ripe time when the organism is impressionable, the central nervous system is impressionable, and it's when there's a good deal of plasticity when we can make change. So that, I think, underlines why there's a kind of, if you will, an urgency
Mhm.
about those 3 years. Well, you mentioned attachment, and there's no question attachment is one key developmental phenomenon of that period, and we know, that attachment really has survival meaning in a sense to it. We as human organisms we're the most helpless and dependent organism for the longest span of any other mammal. And I always say that's the big price we pay for that's the price we pay for having a big brain, you know. But that also means we're very vulnerable, right? And attachment is our best bet for surviving physically and our best bet for thriving. So, forming an enduring emotional tie to our parents or important caregivers really is foundational. And I like to think that the relationships are the cradle of development, right? We really unfold best and more fully in a relationship that is trusting and where the child develops a sense of confident expectation that, someone's there for me if the bottom falls out and I have a safe harbor. So, and what we know about securely attached kids is that when you look at them longitudinally, they really do quite well. I mean, they're curious, they're more cooperative, they have better relationships with peers. I mean, it's not a guarantee, but we
Mhm.
think of it, as a very powerful protective factor.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then, of course, with that, there's a cognitive development. Children in this period are constructing knowledge. They're constructing knowledge from their relationships with first people, of course, but then relationships to objects. And of course, play starts to be an important means by which children in this birth to three period learn. And so play is so important because it's the natural way in which kids learn. It's spontaneous and it's child-led, and and a lot of early cognitive development is happening through play. So that's another big arena uh, that's in full gear during this birth to three period.
Okay. And what happens at age 3? Like what tops off at age 3?
Well, age three is kind of it's a kind of a point where a lot of things consolidate. So a lot of what the child is working on, in those first 3 years start to come together. Like children by that age are pretty symbolic in their play and their language. So they've really moved from being pre-symbolic to, having a communicative system, a play system. We believe by three, and this builds on the attachment that you underline, by about three, children should have internalized their attachment figure. So they now have the love object, in a sense, mentalized, and they can now start to draw on their evocative memory.
Mhm.
So, and of course, they're also cognitively now moving, into more abstract thinking after, at about three. And their play also becomes symbolic. So, children before three have pretty much been sensory motor learners. They learn by touching and feeling and mouthing and banging. And then they start to learn how objects work. But by about fully, I mean, it starts earlier, but by about three, they're pretty fully symbolic. So it's a period in which a lot consolidates and then moves them into the preschool years.
Can you just expound for a minute on the concept of the internalization of attachment figures or self-object? To talk a little bit about what that means. Give us, an understanding of what it is precisely that's happening, that's being introjected.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're using all the right language.
Oh,
I know you're a professional in the field. So, through our experience with our love objects, we form images of them. We have memory of them, and we think, you begin to. I like to almost think of it as a bit photographic. It's almost like we have all this data in our brain. And in the old days, when you had a photograph and you had to put it in the fluid and then the image would form. Well, that's sort of what it's like. The child's experiencing their love objects and it's being internalized, and it's like a photographic paper. And then after a while, it starts to consolidate and the image comes up. So children not only have visual representations, but of course they have emotional memories. And
mhm.
that's very, very important. So it's not just the sort of visual memory, vocal memory, other kinds of memories. It's really also that by three, they start to have the inner representation of the caregiver, but the inner representation of the caregiver with a feeling states associated.
So it's almost like I think if we wanted to simplify this term, let's say a child's self-esteem, the way that they experience themselves in the world as either good or bad, worthy or unworthy, lovable or unlovable. These uh, experiences happen through multitudes and multitudes of back and forth between them and their primary caregiver, and they begin to develop these like self-impressions. Am I a delight to be around? Are people excited when they see me? Are they am I proud worthy? Right? Is that what you're describing?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you characterize it very well. And very early, a lot of our self-esteem is shared. It's shared with our primary caregiver. So, um, how they feel about us and how they respond to us, it's kind of a shared self before it becomes a demarcated individual self. So, yeah, you're absolutely right.
I think it's cool. Like I know in my own child rearing, my first children, my older children, even though we always tried to read parenting books and things like that, but our older children were born before I started learning these concepts, before I was in my master's program, and my later children were born after I learned some of these concepts. And with my younger children, it almost became like a game. When I would interact with them, I would almost visualize the development of their self-esteem, the development of their ego, the development of their uh, uh, self-accepting, their emotional regulation, almost like I'm giving and let's see how they're responding to it. Each time they laughed or giggled or felt satisfied, let's do more of that because I know what it's giving them. You could almost watch the process unfold in front of you.
Absolutely. And as you really underlined the serve and return, we sometimes
Mhm.
call it, the back and forth in the relationship is such a key and important element in establishing the relationship, the trust, and the feelings of confidence and self-esteem.
Okay. I wanted to thank Aaron Herzog for connecting us tonight. Aaron, did you have a question you wanted to ask? I saw your hand was raised before.
Oh, hi, Aaron.
Hi, Dr. Gilbert. I wanted to ask regarding how do I know if there's any signs to know if an infant will develop later in life some mental disorders.
Well, I mean, it's a good question, of course. I mean, I think I would say this. I mean, certainly we know that there are markers, certainly if a child isn't acquiring developmental skills when you would expect them to, they're not relating, they're not responding to the caregiver, they aren't developing language when they would, or play skills. Um, their affect is, well, poorly regulated. Moshe brought that up. Affect regulation is so important, that they can learn to, with our help, and because a lot of it is co-regulation until a child really becomes self-regulated. But a child who can't modulate their reactions and their feeling states, can't grade them. These would be signs. I would also say, though, I mean, certainly early signs are important, but I think that's where things have sort of theoretically changed. When I was being trained, we thought that, what happened then was so fixed, and that what happened later just built on what was early, and it was kind of continuous. We now know those early years, of course, are important, but that the organism is much more flexible and much more plastic than we used to think. So important to look for those markers and to have intervention. But I think there's a good chance we can modify it if we start young.
Well, give us just a brief overview. What are some important um, behaviors or processes that young parents or parents of young children or parents, their first, children, early parents should be mindful of both to do and to refrain from?
Well, I think, one of the important things is to be available for your children, both physically and emotionally. Emotional availability is really important, meaning that you're attuned to their feelings. I think this whole idea that you brought up, serve and return, as much back and forth interactions, responding to the child, is really important. I think serving as a co-regulator, because we know children early can't always grade or modulate their feelings. They get overexcited and they can't get themselves back to base. And so we help them, right? We may give them signals, we may give them a hug. I think that's helping them to regulate is a big part of our role. I think providing play opportunities for children is really, really important. And I don't think plays I think that, and modulate, be careful about screens, by the way. I mean, I'm not saying there's no place for screens, but be very careful. And I can't cite them for you, but the American Academy of Pediatrics do have guidelines about screens. And I say that in conjunction with play because I think that's the problem. Kids who are on screens, among other things, they're not playing and they're not relating and they're not getting back and forth. And it's a form of deprivation, really.
Mhm.
So I would say those, love your children, be emotionally available, engage in serve and return, um, provide play experience for them, serve as a co-regulator to help them. Uh, I think
So,
that's
Gil, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the various methods of sleep training? This is a contentious topic that people struggle with because the modalities range from the two ends of the spectrum, from never training the child, just allowing the process to organically happen, to trapping the child off in a crib and closing the door, and eventually they'll fall asleep and figure it out. Do you have any data or information or opinions on sleep training?
Well, I think one thing I would say is if the child is fussy and crying, I don't believe in letting them cry it out. Because I think that, crying is a distress signal. A child is telling us they can't cope, they can't manage. And I think we have to listen to the child. I think, one of my mentors was Sally Probbins. She was a pediatrician psychoanalyst at the Yale Child Study Center. And she always used to say, the child will always tell you. It may be in code, but it's our job to decode it. And so a child who's in that much distress can't, they're saying, I can't manage myself. So that's one thing I would say. I would avoid the crying it out. Um, I think things like having a bedtime ritual, for example, um, is helpful for a child. Um, I think,
Meaning because the infant will come to realize that this is the beginning of the end, we're winding down, and they'll
yeah,
start to expect it.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So, if it's a young, very young child, there may be, you're rocking them, you're getting them, trying to get them into a less fully alert state, and you're kind of cooling them down to sleep, and that might involve some rocking, make involve some singing, maybe reading a book. Not that they're necessarily understanding it, but they get the cadence of your voice, etc. And that becomes a transition from the waking state to the sleeping state. So bedtime rituals can help. Um, and I think also if the child does have fears, they're possibly they need a light on. Sometimes white noise, uh, uh, recordings of the human heartbeat.
Training, we're talking about really little kids. I mean, we want 6 months old or 4 months old, right, to start learning that they can't stay up, and not every whim gets taken care of. That it's okay for them to last for longer than 2 hours or 2.5 hours without a feeding. They could go a drop longer, right? These are infants who seem younger than the ones that you're discussing, aren't they?
I missed the part of that, Moshe. Tell me.
So in other words, I'm thinking of really little babies who have to learn that they have to sleep for more than 2 or 3 hours. They can go for 5 or 6 hours. And we want to get them into a routine of falling asleep. So we make their room dark and we try to, soothe them and calm them. But they're not used to this, they want to get their way. And the question is like, obviously, like you said, crying it out is going to teach the child that the world is not responsive to them, as far as I understand. So if you're going to let a child cry for an hour straight, the child's going to learn, the infant is going to learn, okay, the world is not responsive to me. I'm just going to either shut up or shut down, right? And never get my needs met. Right? So that's detrimental forever.
Right.
But on the other hand, if you give in to every whim, and every time a child makes a peep or fusses, you now come in and try to soothe them, you're also never going to train them. Right. So what's the balance in between in such a young age of 6 months?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I mean, we want to, Anna Freud once said, you want to avoid too much gratification and too much deprivation. So, and I think trying to find the balance between gratification and inhibition or deprivation. So, yeah, I mean, I think you do it incrementally, and that's what the co-regulation is about. So the baby gets a little fussy, you go back into the room, you try to get them quiet, and then you step back, and you let the baby start to work on getting them back to sleep, see if they can change their own state down.
Mhm.
You've helped them, you've given them, but you start turning over to the child in increments, in a sense, their responsibility in this case to learn how to change their conscious state from fully alert to drowsy to sleep, for example. So,
Okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I'd love to hear if you have any questions or comments. Go ahead, Rachel. Wait, you're still muted.
Thank you. Thank you. I was just going to use this term self-soothing. I mean, like, in other words, we have to teach them to learn how to self-soothe because that will help with the regulation in the future also. So regulate their emotions even at that very early stage, that there are ways they can soothe themselves.
Yeah, but
Yes.
we want
That's
to avoid.
the pacifier, and whatever else that we give our children at a very young age, and to use it.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's really very, very important. And, even we think about thumb sucking, I know it can have some other implications, but it is kind of often thought the first act of self-sufficiency, where the child is using what they have to try to calm themselves down. So I agree with you.
Yeah.
Very important.
We put them in the tight blankets. We can get, what is it called when they swaddle the baby. All these tricks, they're not even tricks. They're just things for us to help the baby feel comfortable and try to get that on their own. As you said, to set the first step of independence.
That's right. And that's really part of co-regulation that you're talking about. And we help the baby calm, but then we incrementally step back and we start maybe doing a little less and let the baby start to do a little bit more of their own in increments.
But that being said, sometimes we just have to leave them alone and let them cry because we've got to regulate ourselves while they're screaming their heads off and we need to get to sleep. That just inevitably happens. And that's feedback to the child also. That feedback to them that they have to know when to stop crying, and to seek their own way. I don't know, I'd say that. Okay. To stick up for us parents.
But I think something you said was so important, Rachel, keeping ourselves regulated.
Yes.
Because, I think we all know anxiety is contagious in a way, right?
Mhm.
So the more we get dysregulated, then the more the baby reads that in us, and now you've got a cycle going. So I think it's really important that we keep ourselves as regulated as we can.
Okay, yeah, great point. Thank you, Esther.
I think that kind of segues into the question I was going to ask about the highly sensitive child.
That was my next question. Yeah. But what do we
Yes.
do when we have a child who's not easily soothable? Is there, and again, there's like two categories of this. There's the ASD child, who's one category, and then there's the child who's more neurotypical, but just doesn't seem to be able to be soothed. Sometimes people call it colic, others recognize it as a sensory issue.
Yeah, yeah. Really, really good point. I'm glad you brought it up. It's an area of interest of mine. I just did a book with an occupational therapist, Dr. Susan Stolling-Saylor, and I did a book called Linking Sensory Integration and Mental Health, Nurturing Self-Regulation in Infants and Young Children. And I bring that up because we do know there are some babies who are hypersensitive, and we sometimes call this fussy baby syndrome. We know colic happens to many babies and it should abate, but with some babies, it doesn't abate. And when it doesn't abate, we probably have a child who fits this fussy baby syndrome, meaning that they're probably hypersensitive in a number of their sensory systems. They tend to overreact to stimuli. Often these babies can't tolerate more than one stimuli at a time. I had a wonderful colleague, Gordon Williamson, an OT, and he used to show this tape and use it as an example, a baby who was in a very hyper aroused state, fussing, and the mom was doing all the things that we might do. She was rocking the baby, she walked the baby, she bounced the baby, and the more she did it, the more aroused the baby got. Because that baby couldn't tolerate it. They should work, but that baby couldn't tolerate all that input. And then she handed the baby to dad, and dad just held the baby very firmly, didn't make any noises, didn't move, and the baby calmed. So again, I think it speaks to these babies who can't tolerate a lot of extra stimuli or multiple inputs. And in fact, rather than calming them, it overexcites them. So those babies are difficult. And I just want to say it's also very difficult on parents. Even, these are good enough parents, they're good parents. But these babies are difficult and they're confusing, and you can't read their signals often. And so here, I think, when we have a baby like that, I think often occupational therapists can help us to think about the right sensory diet for them and, the best ways in which we can give them stimuli and try to get them regulated.
So you're saying from a developmental perspective, there's very little that can be done other than addressing the sensory issue in terms of, let's say, relational co-regulating and relational input between primary caregiver, parent, and child and infant. And there's very little that can actually be done to salvage or to, it's like we have those babies and we want to ensure that they settle down and that they're not in distress, and we can't help them. We can't seem to help them get out of that distress.
Yeah. That's, of course we still want to give those babies a loving relationship and be available.
Mhm.
But it often is hard to do that because the baby doesn't give us the feedback, that
They
that
stay
we're
in distress, they
effective.
stay in distress. They don't accept it.
Yes. Yes. And then it's very hurtful for parents and they feel like they're not successful and they're not competent and they're not satisfied in their parenting role. So it can start a vicious cycle.
Negative cycle, a negative relational cycle of
Yes.
resentment, and that's terrible. That'd be really disastrous for the baby, for the child. Yeah.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about, can we talk a little bit about autistic spectrum
Yeah.
disorder in babies and how that affects, or how, is there any way, positive input that parents can provide to neurotypical, or neurodivergent infants that might actually assist or save them in some way from being completely shut off from their emotions?
Well, I very much, I've been influenced by the work of Greenspan and Weider and DIR, Developmental Individual Difference Relationship-Based Approach. And I think, again, with these children, first of all, watching them, I think there's something we said for waiting, watching, and wondering, and then figuring out how we can join them, follow their lead, look what they are interested in, join them where they are, and start then trying to build on what they do. And also to think about using your own emotion as a way to woo them into relating to you. So it's rather than doing to them, but starting by following them and doing with them. And that way we can try to join them. And then we can start to build in increments from that point. And I think that's an important dimension of it.
Mhm, mhm. But what about the ones that, the little babies who just don't respond? They just stare blankly at the parent's face.
Yeah.
It would more positive input or persistent smiling, delight, and that kind of information, does that affect the baby eventually if they're on the autistic spectrum? Or if they don't have those social wiring, there's no way to impart that.
No, I certainly wouldn't say there's no way. I mean, I think we have to find alternate ways. And I think, again, trying to figure out what your baby is telling you and what they need, what their signals are. And again, joining them where they are, as simple as it may be. I mean, if the baby might be shaking something, let's say, and I might go over and shake something with them, or they're shaking something and I might tap what they're shaking and add another dimension to it. And often can be little increments like that to find your port of entry, so to speak. But I mean, for some babies, it's tough. I mean, it's hard work, and you have to be very attuned to them emotionally too, and
Mhm,
have some sense about what feeling state they might be
mhm,
in as well.
mhm. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments at this point? Okay. Let me ask a question. Here we have, in so many different forms, we can ask this question, but let's just simplify it. Here we have parents who did a less than perfect job. Either they were passive and neglectful, if we can call it that, in their emotional input, co-regulation. They may have been overwhelmed, struggling, or just plain not have the skills themselves. Or we have parents who were uh, um, anxious, critical, demeaning, frustrated with a little baby who they didn't realize would take up so much of their energy, etc. I guess this is a question both for parents and for therapists. What do we do to repair what was lost or repair the damage that was done?
Well, I think that's where the work you do and the work I do, and I suspect some of you in the audience do, where we, use various methodologies, whether it's parent-infant psychotherapy, whether it's DIR, but where we're really trying to, and I think this is the important thing, not just work with the child or with the parent, but we're working with them together. We treat to the relationship, to what, and to the goodness of fit between the child and the parent. And so we're working to try to help each of them get on the same path so they're not like two ships passing in the night, that they're really interacting.
Mhm,
And that's why I think the work has to be with the parent and child together to see if we can repair the match, repair the disconnect that there might be, whether it's from, as you say, unavailability, overindulgence, whatever.
And for parents who are not, let's say, engaging in psychotherapy with their child or family therapy, what should they be mindful of in terms of repairing some of the damage that was done if they're just, continuing to interact now with their 4-year-old or 6-year-old or 8-year-old or teenager for that matter?
Teenager. Well, by the
Forget
time
about the
you're a
teenager. They're
teenager,
lost.
you don't want to wait till then. That's that you know that because by then you've got defenses and you've got other stuff, that have
But what's
overlaid.
interesting about the teenager is that, like, I see the teenage stage very similar to the terrible two stage,
It is.
where in both cases they're fighting for independence, right? The 2-year-old is saying, like, wait a minute, I can do this myself. I could choose a cookie. I don't need mom to give me peas, right? And the teenager is saying, I could choose an outfit. I don't need mom to tell me what looks good. And now she doesn't even know. She's way, she's ancient. So in a sense, they're both. I wonder how much repair can be done if parents of teenagers would redo or repair what they did improperly, or if we could speak in English, where they messed up, right? When their child was 2.
I mean, I have to say, I've not really worked much with teenagers. It's not an area I know about a lot. I mean, I think there's always hope. I mean, I think there's always hope, but I think the longer it goes, the more it gets, we talked about internalized, the more it gets kind of fixed, the more it gets overlaid with defense, emotions.
Mhm,
And that's why, as we started out, Moshe, that's why I think birth to three is so important because
mhm,
there's where we can, do it. And I always just tell my graduate students, developmental work is always preferable to reconstructive work. Let's work to get it right the first time, then we don't have to undo it and redo it. I did want to just share with you, about this is attachment related because I think it's important. John Bowlby, who was the father of attachment theory, I've elaborated on it a little bit, but talk about what qualities of caregiving are likely to give a rise to a secure attachment. And their sensitivity, meaning that the parent is able to read the cues of the baby. They have some idea what the baby needs, what state they're in. they act on what they believe the baby needs. So they're responsive, they're sensitive, they're responsive, and they do it reliably, right? Not perfectly, but they respond reliably. And they do it benevolently with a feeling of goodness and positivity. And they do it in a way that's attuned. So they don't only meet the physical need, but they're also aware of the emotional state of the child, right? And they do it with continuity. So I think, if you think about those qualities, sensitive, responsive, reliable, benevolent, attuned, and continuous caregiving, I think those are important words and ideas and we have a lot of empirical evidence that those are the qualities that give rise to a secure attachment. And I often say when I talk about this, and those are the same qualities that make for a good marital relationship, a good friendship,
Friendships.
right?
Sure, sure. Can you share some uh, behaviors or things that new parents should be mindful of to not do or to be aware of that may be detrimental that perhaps younger parents might not even realize?
Well, I would go back to those qualities, get to know your baby,
Mhm.
get to know what your baby is telling you, respond to that. I think, you know, I understand that there's a lot of in the literature now, in the popular literature, parents are handling children less. They're putting them in some of these. I understand there are these cribs that sort of move and have sounds and that's not a substitute for a human connection. That's not substitute for skin to skin contact, for example. So, I think going back to being physically connected to your baby and also then knowing when they're also telling you to separate too. Right? You don't want to hold on too long, too
Mhm,
close.
mhm.
And I think it's getting to know your baby. And as I say, the baby will tell you if we are tuned to the baby and we watch the baby's signals.
So a lot of it comes to really spending time, both quantitatively and qualitatively, getting to know your baby, having contact with your baby, um, uh, syncing with your baby,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um, and then responding in a way that you intuitively would based on the cues that the baby is sharing with you.
absolutely. And don't forget shared pleasure. Shared pleasure is very important, both for the baby and the parent. It should be, it should be fun in some ways, and it should be satisfying, and there should be a lot of pleasure in it.
What else might, go ahead. What are you going to say?
I'm sorry.
Were you going to say something?
No, I was going to say one of the things I always ask parents in interviewing them is, what do you like to do best with your baby? What's the most fun? When do you feel the most connected to your baby? I think finding those moments and building on those are really, really important because those are the moments where there's a connectedness that really starts to create that attachment connection.
Mhm, mhm. Is there anything that um, you've discovered or are passionate about in this topic that you'd like to share with the participants? Anything more that we haven't yet covered?
Well, we've covered a lot. I guess one thing that came to my mind, and because I think this is an issue today that does concern me a little bit, I think we have to be careful not to overstimulate young children. I think, I worry that there was a time when I guess in my era, you kept your baby at home, you didn't go out with them, and maybe we weren't giving them enough stimuli. But I think now many children are vastly overstimulated, whether it's, screens, whether it's television, whether it's too many toys, whether it's being exposed to too many environmental stimuli. So I would just say I think we need to be thinking about what's the right dose for your baby
Mhm, mhm.
and not to overstimulate the
What
baby.
what happens? What are the risks of overstimulating?
Well, I think babies don't have too many options, as you pointed out. They can respond by crying, by getting in a state of hyperarousal and agitation, or they can shut down. They don't have a lot of middle ground yet, right? And a baby who's too much in either one of those extremes is not good. I worry that the baby who has to shut down too much to cope, is that a precursor to depression? I mean, and the child who is hyper aroused too much, is that a precursor to problems with emotional regulation?
Emotional regulation and maybe ADHD, like the inability to sit with oneself,
Right, right.
be okay with oneself.
Someone had something in the chat.
Yeah, is there a difference that school children usually start school younger now as more mothers are working?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think, that can be good, but I I I still think there's important to have a time with your baby to fall in love, right? And to get to know them and to have the kind of intimacy that really spawns the kind of knowing that we're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, are there any other questions before we call it a night? Somebody unmuted there?
I just wanted to say something. You were asking before about repairing a relationship. I have experience as a parent, and I always tell people in therapy that it's so important to allow them to express anger. I mean, these kids have anger, over not being heard, not being seen, not being dismissed, all kinds of things. And it's just important to listen, let them get it out and accept it.
Well, I certainly agree with you. We have to create an environment where children can deal with a range of emotions, and even those that are negative. And I know there's a lot of issues today about aggression, but one of the things I was to say is that you don't learn to manage a strong emotion by completely avoiding it. You learn to manage it by experiencing it, expressing it, getting co-regulated by a caregiver who is loving and responsive. So I agree with you. Children have to learn to manage a range of emotions, including the negative ones.
Gil, I know you wrote a number of books, and there's some resources out there. Where could people, if somebody wants to find some of your resources, what's out there?
Well, the most current book, as I said, is from published by National 0 to 3, and that's the one linking sensory integration and mental health. The previous book was a professional book that was from Brooks. That's out of print, but it's called that one was Mental Health and Early Intervention, and that is available, I think on Amazon, but usually used copies and things like that. And then I did a book on cognitive development. That's also out of print, but I suppose is available there too.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for participating tonight and joining and sharing this with us. We really appreciate it. Definitely gives us something to think about, and another reminder and inspiration of how vital, we're dealing with something so delicate at the young age of infancy and stage of infancy, something that's so delicate that that we leave indelible impressions, and their entire, I shouldn't say entire, but a large part of people's future and experiences in this world is predicated on how we interact with them in those early beginnings. So it's such an important topic, and thank you very much for shedding light on it.
Thank you, Moshe, for having me, and thank you for your very insightful and informed questions, and all of you in the audience as well.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.